Billionaire Tycoon paid a stranger to have his child. Years later, his son wants to know her. Before starting this story, I'd like to take a moment to ask for your help. If you enjoy this story, please help the channel reach the goal of 1,000 subscribers. I'd be very happy if you could subscribe. Without further delay, let's dive into this emotional story. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Blackwood's penthouse office on the 47th floor of the Blackwood Tower in Manhattan. At 38, he had built an empire from nothing. Tech startups, real estate ventures, and pharmaceutical patents that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in America. But success had come at a price. 3 failed marriages, countless broken relationships, and a diagnosis that shattered his dreams of a traditional family. He was infertile. The letter from his oncologist still lay open on his mahogany desk, the words blurring as he read them for the 100th time. The experimental cancer treatment that had saved his life at 25 had also destroyed any chance of biological children. Yet Marcus Blackwood was not a man who accepted defeat. "Sir, she's here," his assistant Janet announced through the intercom, her voice cutting through his brooding thoughts. Emma Rodriguez entered the office with measured steps, her worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished marble floor. At 23, she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the circumstances that had brought her here. Her nursing scrubs were wrinkled from a double shift at Mount Sinai Hospital, and exhaustion shadowed her dark eyes. Behind her walked Dr. Harrison, the fertility specialist who had arranged this unconventional meeting. "Ms. Rodriguez," Marcus stood, extending his hand with the same formal courtesy he used in board meetings. "Thank you for considering my proposal." Emma's handshake was firm but brief. She had read the contract 3 times, each clause more surreal than the last. $2 million to carry a child conceived through artificial insemination using a donor egg and his preserved genetic material from before his treatment. No contact during pregnancy except medical checkups. Complete surrender of parental rights upon birth. It was clinical, cold, and exactly what her dying mother needed. "My mother's medical bills are overwhelming," Emma said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The experimental treatment in Switzerland, it's her only chance." Marcus nodded, understanding desperation intimately. "Dr. Harrison has explained the process. You'll have the best medical care, a comfortable apartment in the Upper East Side, and a monthly allowance for all expenses. After the birth, you're free to pursue your nursing career with a substantial head start." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the city's distant hum 47 floors below. Emma stared out at the glittering lights of Manhattan, thinking of her mother's frail hands and labored breathing. This man before her was offering salvation, wrapped in a Faustian bargain. "I need to know something," she said finally, turning to face him. "What happens to the child? Will you love them?" Marcus's jaw tightened. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, a weakness that had cost him too much. "The child will have everything. The best education, opportunities, security. That's more than most children ever receive." Emma studied his face, seeing past the expensive suit and commanding presence to something hollow underneath. She thought of her own childhood, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs but never missed a school play or scraped knee. Love couldn't be bought, but survival could. "I'll do it," she whispered, and with those 3 words, she sealed both their fates in ways neither could imagine. 9 months stretched like an eternity between Emma and the life she'd known. The luxury apartment on East 79th Street felt like a gilded cage, its pristine white walls and modern furniture reflecting none of her personality. Each morning she woke to the gentle hum of Central Park traffic below and the weight of the life growing inside her. Dr. Sarah Chen, the obstetrician Marcus had hired, visited twice weekly. "Everything looks perfect, Emma," she said during the 20-week appointment, adjusting the ultrasound wand across Emma's rounded belly. "The baby is healthy and developing beautifully." On the screen, tiny fingers moved in what looked like a wave, and Emma's heart clenched. She had tried to maintain emotional distance, to think of this as merely a job, But the reality of carrying another human being made detachment impossible. Late at night, when the city quieted to its urban lullaby, she would place her hands on her belly and whisper stories about her mother's strength and her own dreams of healing others. Marcus kept his distance, as stipulated in their contract. The monthly payments arrived punctually, and any communication came through his legal team. But sometimes, from her bedroom window, Emma would see his black sedan idling across the street. She wondered if he was curious about the child he'd commissioned, but would never know. The only personal touch in the apartment was a small photo of her mother, Maria, taken before the cancer had stolen her vibrant smile. The Swiss treatment was working. Slowly, expensively, but working. Their weekly video calls were Emma's lifeline to the world outside her pampered imprisonment. "Mija, you look tired," Maria observed during one such call, her own face gaunt but alert on the laptop screen. "Are you taking care of yourself?" Emma nodded, unconsciously rubbing her belly. She couldn't tell her mother about the strange dreams she'd been having. Dreams where she held the baby and couldn't let go. Dreams where she ran through the streets of New York clutching a child that looked like the ultrasound images burned. To her memory, at 36 weeks, Emma's water broke during a thunderstorm that reminded her of the night she'd first met Marcus. Dr. Chen arrived within minutes, her team transforming the apartment's spare bedroom into a makeshift deliveries room. The labor was long and difficult, 18 hours of pain that felt like penance for the choice she'd made. When the baby finally arrived, a son with dark hair and surprisingly alert eyes, Emma held him for exactly 3 minutes before Dr. Chen gently took him away. In those 3 minutes, the world shifted on its axis. The baby's tiny fingers wrapped around hers with surprising strength, and she felt a connection so profound it threatened to shatter her resolve. "He's beautiful," Dr. Chen whispered, weighing and examining the newborn with practiced efficiency. 8 pounds, 2 ounces, perfect in every way. Through the window, Emma glimpsed Marcus's sedan arriving in the pre-dawn darkness. Soon, he would take his son and disappear into his world of privilege and power. The $2 million would save her mother's life. But as she watched the baby being prepared for his new life, Emma realized the cost might be higher than she'd ever imagined. The last thing she saw before closing her eyes was the baby's face, and she whispered a prayer that somewhere in his privileged future, he would find the love that his father seemed capable of giving. 16 years passed like pages turning in a book Marcus never learned to read. Alexander Blackwood grew up in the shadow of his father's empire, a carefully orchestrated life of private schools, elite tutors, and supervised activities. Marcus provided everything money could buy. The penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, a fleet of luxury cars, memberships to exclusive clubs, and acceptance letters to Ivy League universities written before Alexander could even read. But love remained the one commodity Marcus Blackwood never learned to trade. "Your father will be late again," Mrs. Peterson, Alexander's longtime nanny, announced as she served dinner in the formal dining room. At 62, she had been the closest thing to a mother Alexander had ever known, though even she maintained the professional distance Marcus demanded of all employees. Alexander, now 16, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's sharp jawline, barely looked up from his physics textbook. He had learned not to expect his father's presence at family dinners, birthday celebrations, or school events. Marcus's absence had become as reliable as his financial support. The silence in their Park Avenue penthouse was different from the comfortable quiet of a loving home. It was the silence of two strangers sharing an address, connected by biology, but separated by an emotional chasm that seemed to widen each year. Alexander had stopped asking about his mother when he was 8, after Marcus's cold response. "She served her purpose. That's all you need to know." At Dalton School, Alexander excelled academically but struggled socially. His classmates, mostly children of other wealthy families, sensed something different about him. A sadness that expensive clothes couldn't hide. A hunger for connection that private jets couldn't satisfy. He found solace in science and mathematics, subjects where problems had clear solutions, unlike the emotional equations that governed his daily life. Mr. Blackwood, your son's guidance counselor, called, Mrs. Peterson mentioned one evening as Marcus hurried through the foyer, briefcase in hand, heading to another late meeting. Alexander's been asking questions about college applications, about what he wants to study. Marcus paused, his hand on the elevator button. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Perhaps curiosity, maybe regret. Harvard pre-law, it's already arranged. But he's interested in medicine, specifically nursing. Nursing. Marcus's voice carried a sharp edge. Absolutely not. Blackwoods don't serve others. Others serve us. That night, Alexander overheard the conversation from his bedroom doorway, and something inside him finally broke. Nursing, the profession his unknown mother had pursued, according to the private investigator he'd secretly hired with his substantial allowance. For weeks he had been learning about Emma Rodriguez, the brave young woman who had carried him and then disappeared from his life forever. The investigator's report lay hidden beneath his mattress. Emma had used the money to save her mother's life, completed her nursing degree summa cum laude, and now worked as a pediatric nurse at a community hospital in Queens. She had never married, never had other children, and according to social media photos, still kept a small picture of a newborn baby on her bedside table. Alexander stared out at the glittering Manhattan skyline, the same view his father had contemplated. The night he'd decided to buy a child instead of earning a family. Tomorrow he would turn 17, and Marcus would likely send another expensive gift with a card signed by his assistant. But for the first time in his privileged, lonely life, Alexander had a different plan. He was going to find the woman who had given him life and discover what love actually looked like. Before continuing with the story, I'd like to take a moment to ask for your help. If you're enjoying this story, please help the channel reach the goal of 1,000 subscribers. I'd truly appreciate it if you could subscribe. Now, back to the story. Alexander's 17th birthday arrived with the familiar ritual of expensive neglect. A Rolex submariner appeared on his breakfast table beside a card signed, "Happy Birthday, Son, M.A. Blackwood," in his father's assistant's handwriting. Marcus had left for Singapore before dawn, another business trip that would keep him away for 2 weeks. Mrs. Peterson had prepared his favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes and fresh orange juice. But Alexander couldn't taste anything. The private investigator's report burned in his backpack, and today was the day he would finally act on information that had kept him awake for months. "I'm going to visit some colleges today," he told Mrs. Peterson, the lie coming easily after. Years of practicing emotional distance. Columbia and NYU, drivers picking me up at 10. But instead of heading to Manhattan's universities, Alexander directed the driver to Queens General Hospital, where Emma Rodriguez had worked in the pediatric ward for the past 3 years. His heart hammered against his ribs as they crossed the Queensboro Bridge, the Manhattan skyline shrinking behind them like his old life. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and hope, a sharp contrast to the sterile luxury of his world. Alexander approached the information desk with sweaty palms, suddenly realizing he had no plan beyond finding the woman who had carried him. "Excuse me," he said to the elderly volunteer, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm looking for Emma Rodriguez. She works in pediatrics." The woman consulted her computer, frowning. "Visiting hours don't start until 2, honey. Are you family?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Family. Yes, sort of. 20 minutes later, Alexander found himself in the hospital cafeteria, nursing a cup of terrible coffee and watching the entrance to the pediatric ward. He had memorized Emma's face from the investigator's photos. She was 39 now, her dark hair shorter than it had been when she was 23. Laugh lines creasing the corners of her eyes that suggested a capacity for joy his father had never possessed. When she finally appeared, walking with 2 other nurses toward the elevator, Alexander's breath caught. She moved with purpose and confidence, stopping to comfort a crying child in the hallway, her entire demeanor radiating warmth. This was the woman who had sacrificed 9 months of her life to give him existence, then walked away to save her mother. "Emma?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned, and for a moment, time suspended itself. Her eyes widened as she took in his appearance. The expensive clothes, the familiar bone structure, the dark eyes that mirrored her own. "Oh my God," she breathed, one hand flying to her chest. "Alexander?" The sound of his name on her lips, spoken with recognition and something that might have been longing, nearly broke his carefully constructed composure. "You know who I am?" Emma glanced around the busy hallway, then gently took his elbow. "Come with me, please." She led him to a small break room, closing the door behind them. For several minutes, they simply stared at each other. 16 years of separation, and wondering compressed into a space barely large enough for two people. "I have thought about you every day," Emma said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Every single day for 16 years. I wondered if you were happy, if you were loved, if you ever thought about—" She stopped, unable to finish. "He doesn't love me," Alexander said simply, the words coming out in a rush. "My father. He's never... I don't think he knows how. And I've been searching for you because I needed to know if someone ever did." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out tentatively as if afraid he might disappear. When he didn't pull away, she cupped his face in her hands, hands that had delivered dozens of babies, comforted countless children, and carried the weight of an impossible choice for 16 years. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered. "I loved you. From the moment I felt you move. Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I hoped, that he would give you something I couldn't." Alexander leaned into her touch, feeling something he'd never experienced. Unconditional maternal love. "Can you tell me about my mother? The real story?" And so, in a hospital break room that smelled of coffee and antiseptic, Emma Rodriguez began to tell her son the truth about the transaction that had created him, and the love that had never let him go. Marcus returned from Singapore to find his carefully controlled world in chaos. Alexander hadn't come home the previous night. Mrs. Peterson was frantically fielding calls from school administrators, and his security team had tracked his son's phone to a Queens address that made Marcus's blood run cold. Emma Rodriguez lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Astoria, a world away from the penthouse luxury Alexander had known his entire life. Marcus stood outside the building at 7 in the morning, his black town car idling behind him like a mechanical beast ready to devour the past he'd tried so hard to bury. The building was old but well-maintained, with small balconies overlooking a tree-lined street where children played and neighbors actually knew each other's names. Everything about it represented the kind of life Marcus had rejected in his relentless pursuit of success and control. He climbed to the 3rd floor, his Italian leather shoes echoing in the narrow stairwell. Through the thin door of apartment 3B, he could hear voices, his son's deeper tone mixing with a woman's gentle laughter. The sound of Alexander laughing, really laughing, hit Marcus like a physical blow. When was the last time he'd heard his son laugh? His knock silenced the conversation inside. Footsteps approached, and then the door opened to reveal Emma Rodriguez, 16 years older but still recognizably the desperate young woman who had accepted his impossible proposal. She was wearing scrubs again, apparently preparing for another shift at the hospital, and her face showed no surprise at seeing him. "Marcus," she said simply, not moving aside to let him enter. "I wondered when you'd come. Where is my son?" His voice carried the cold authority that had intimidated boardrooms and built empires, but Emma didn't flinch. "He's sleeping. We talked until very late." She paused, studying his face with eyes that had seen too much sadness in pediatric wards to be impressed by wealth or power. He needed to understand where he came from. He came from a legal transaction that you were well compensated for. Nothing more. Emma's expression hardened. He came from my body, my blood, 9 months of my life. He came from a choice I made to save my mother, but also from love I felt for a child I carried. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. And he came from your inability to understand that money can't buy what children need. Behind her, Alexander appeared in the doorway, looking more rested and peaceful than Marcus had seen him in years. His hair was mussed from sleep, and he wore borrowed clothes that didn't cost more than most people's rent. But his eyes held something new, a sense of belonging, of being truly seen and valued. "Dad," Alexander said, the word carrying no warmth. "Emma told me everything, about Mom's cancer, about why she had to let me go, about why you chose business over being a father." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the armor he'd built around his heart. "I gave you everything. The best schools, the best opportunities. You gave me money," Alexander interrupted, his voice steady but sad. "You never gave me yourself. Do you even remember my last birthday, my interests, what I want to study in college?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Marcus realized with growing horror that he couldn't answer any of them. His son was a stranger, raised in his house but never truly known. Emma watched the exchange with compassion that somehow made Marcus feel even smaller. "Alexander wants to study medicine," she said gently. "He wants to be a pediatric nurse to help children the way I've tried to help them. He has your intelligence and determination, but he also has empathy. He could make a real difference in the world." "Nursing is beneath a Blackwood," Marcus said automatically, the words sounding hollow even to him. "No, Dad," Alexander said, moving to stand beside Emma. "What's beneath a Blackwood is using money to avoid responsibility. What's beneath a Blackwood is buying a child and then refusing to love him." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus looked at his son standing beside the woman who had carried him, their faces sharing an expression of patient hope, mixed with profound disappointment. For the first time in decades, Marcus Blackwood was facing a problem that couldn't be solved with money, power, or legal contracts. Emma's hand found Alexander's shoulder, a simple gesture of support that spoke volumes about the connection they'd forged in just 24 hours. "He doesn't have to choose," she said quietly, looking directly at Marcus. "He can have both parents in his life, if one of them is willing to learn what love actually means." Marcus stared at them, seeing clearly for the first time what his money had truly bought him. A son who didn't know him, a legacy built on loneliness, and a future that stretched ahead empty of everything that mattered. The choice was his: continue being the billionaire who had everything except what counted, or become the father Alexander had always needed. Outside, the city hummed with life and possibility, and for the first time in 16 years, Marcus Blackwood wasn't sure what his next move should be.